And now we turn to the ongoing discussion about Greenland. For the President of the United States, Donald Trump has not forgotten Greenland and still does not rule out using military force to gain control of the island. He states this in an interview with NBC News. The president has repeatedly stated that the USA wants to take over Greenland and that the USA needs the Arctic island for the sake of world peace and international security. Previously, Trump suggested that the USA could also buy Greenland. This was a few years ago, which both the Danish and Greenlandic governments have strongly rejected.
Something could happen with Greenland. I'll be honest, we need that for national and international security.
And with that, I can say, good evening. Welcome to you, Keld Jensen, who is a professor, author, and negotiation advisor, and has written an op-ed in Jyllands-Posten where you appeal for Denmark not to play along with Trump's theater, but instead to maintain calm in these ongoing negotiations. What do you actually mean by that?
Well, good evening. I think what's important to understand in Denmark is that Trump is a negotiator before he is a politician. And that means one must understand the tactics, the behavior he exhibits. And if I were to be a bit generalizing, Denmark is not very good at negotiations, especially commercial negotiations, as we see from the American side. So I must say, I think Lars Løkke and Mette Frederiksen, by the way, have done some good things where they don't necessarily play along, but try to create their own agenda. But it might be important, as Lars Løkke also said at one point, not to listen so much to what Trump says, but to understand the value behind it, because there is another purpose. We must remember where he comes from. He comes as a commercial negotiator, and he grew up buying and selling properties on Manhattan in New York. So his mindset is somewhat different from traditional politicians.
And what is it that we overlook from the Danish side if we think we can talk to him and negotiate directly with him, as politicians sometimes tend to do?
I think one important thing is to be careful with the rhetoric that is used. I believe one should be cautious not to talk too much about national interest and frame it as what we in the negotiation world call a zero-sum game. In other words, where we talk about sovereignty, and he might actually be talking about economics. In other words, he might have a completely different goal than just taking over Greenland as such. I think there could be another purpose. And perhaps we should do what I think Mette Frederiksen has sometimes done correctly, where she says, we listen, we understand there is an interest in security policy, but where Denmark sometimes takes a very hard stance. And that's not necessarily the best approach. History has shown that Trump also holds grudges, and they praised Mette Frederiksen and Lars Løkke, and they have also made mistakes. As a negotiation advisor in 2019, I was sitting there at Mette Frederiksen when she said it's absurd when Trump first expressed an interest in Greenland. And now I am a Danish American living in the USA, and the word absurd might work in Danish, but in English it's a total insult, meaning, for example, if I came to you and said, I'm interested in buying your car, and you then respond, that's absurd. That is indeed insulting. It may be that one is not interested in selling, but that's not the way to respond. So that means, I personally believe, and we've seen it before in history, also from Trump's commercial background, that he remembers to hold a grudge. So if someone has tripped him up at some point, he comes back again.
What is your recommendation to the Danish government? So what is the best balancing act in this game, you could call it, that they are involved in?
I would say that the best balancing act is in no way to be accommodating or to pander. I would say one of the things that one tries to do and also should do is that you cannot stand and negotiate alone, neither Denmark nor Greenland. You need to unite with the EU or NATO. Trump tries to do the opposite because he operates on the methodology that he only wants to negotiate with those who have a mandate, that is the authority to negotiate. So he doesn't really recognize the EU because they cannot independently decide anything. In reality, and it is the heads of state in each country who have to do it. Therefore, he has no respect for the EU as an organization. On the contrary, he tries to split the EU negotiator. This means that Denmark should actually try not to follow so much the thesis or agenda he presents, but rather try to create their own. And I would say, so far, it seems to me that they are more reacting than acting in this negotiation. So I might recommend being a bit more proactive.
And be more proactive. What do you actually mean precisely by that? I mean, what should Denmark do? Because they have actually tried to do a lot. Take the lead, talk to the Greenlanders. I could imagine that Mette Frederiksen thinks they have tried to act and not just react.
I would come up with some more suggestions, and I would accommodate more suggestions, on what could be the real genuine interest of the USA. Now, I'm saying something I don't know, but I actually don't believe that Trump's real interest is just to take over Greenland. We have seen this both with his initiatives towards Canada and Panama, and with various things where he gestures broadly and says the USA would like to take over that.
But doesn't one risk giving him an inch then?
No, not really, because one has to engage in dialogue and actually find out what is it that you really want. And instead of sitting and saying we are not open to negotiation, we don't want to have a dialogue. One must try to ask, what is it that you actually want? You can't just come and say, I want Greenland. What is the value behind that? What is the motive? What is your interest? How can we collaborate on these things? And I think there might be something going on behind the scenes. I'm not behind the scenes, but I think maybe there's a bit of dialogue missing, which perhaps the Danish side is trying, but at least hasn't succeeded in getting through with.
That's how it sounded. Thank you very much for joining us, Keld Jensen, and for sharing your perspective on what is happening behind the scenes, which we are not always fully aware of. Thank you for that.